The dust kicked up from the stagecoach wheels as it rolled into Redemption Creek, a small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. Sarah McKenna pressed her face against the window, watching the wooden buildings and weathered faces of the townspeople as they went about their daily business. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from the excitement of arriving somewhere new, but from the weight of the secret she carried, a secret that had forced her to flee everything she'd ever known. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the general store, and Sarah gathered her few belongings, a worn carpet bag, a faded photograph, and the letter that had changed everything. As she stepped down onto the dusty main street, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she pulled her bonnet lower to shield her face. She couldn't afford to be recognized. Not here, not anywhere. "Ma'am, you need help with anything?" The voice belonged to a tall man with kind eyes and calloused hands, wearing a sheriff's badge that caught the sunlight. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the wind, and when he smiled, Sarah felt something flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. "No, thank you, Sheriff," she began, then realized she didn't know his name. Cole. Sheriff Cole Hartwell. He tipped his hat. "And you are?" Sarah hesitated. She'd practiced this moment 100 times during the long journey west, but now, looking into his honest face, the lie felt heavier than ever. Sarah Mitchell. The false name tasted bitter on her tongue. Before you continue reading this incredible story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and I love connecting with viewers from all over. Sheriff Hartwell nodded and gestured toward the boarding house at the end of the street. "Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment if you're looking for a place to stay. Tell her I sent you. She'll take good care of you." As Sarah walked toward the boarding house, she could feel his eyes on her, and she wondered if he could somehow see through her carefully constructed facade. But truth was, Sarah McKenna was not Sarah Mitchell, and she was running from more than just a place. She was running from a man who had promised to love her, but had shown her only cruelty, from a family who had turned their backs on her when she needed them most, and from a scandal that would follow her to the grave if anyone discovered it. The boarding house was modest but welcoming, with lace curtains in the windows and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with graying hair and a warm smile, showed Sarah to a small room on the second floor. "You running from something, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently as she set fresh linens on the bed. Sarah's hands trembled as she unpacked her few belongings. "Isn't everyone out here running from something?" Mrs. Patterson chuckled. "I suppose that's true enough. Well, whatever it is, you'll find Redemption Creek lives up to its name. Folks here believe in second chances." That evening, Sarah sat by her window, watching the town settle into twilight. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows, and she could hear the distant sound of a piano from the saloon. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. Maybe here, in this small town where nobody knew her real name or her shameful past, she could finally find peace. But peace, Sarah would soon learn, was not something that came easily to those who carried secrets. And Sheriff Cole Hartwell, with his penetrating gaze and gentle manner, would prove to be both her salvation and her greatest challenge. The next morning brought with it the harsh reality of survival. Sarah had enough money to last perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she was careful. She needed work, and in a town like Redemption Creek, Opportunities for a woman alone were limited. She could sew, she could cook, and she could read and write better than most. But none of these skills seemed particularly valuable in a place where survival often depended on more practical abilities. She was walking past the schoolhouse when she heard raised voices from inside. Through the open door, she could see a group of children sitting restlessly, while a frazzled-looking woman tried to maintain order. "I tell you, I can't do this anymore," the woman was saying to someone Sarah couldn't see. "These children need a real teacher, not someone who's just trying to help out. I have my own family to tend to, and my husband says—" "Mrs. Caldwell, please," came a familiar voice. Sheriff Hartwell stepped into view, his hat in his hands. "We've been through this before. There's no one else qualified, and these children need their education." "Then find someone else," Mrs. Caldwell snapped, untying her apron. "I'm done." Sarah found herself stepping through the doorway before she could think better of it. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you in need of a teacher?" Both adults turned to look at her, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn under their scrutiny. Sheriff Hartwell's eyes lit up with something that might have been relief, while Mrs. Caldwell looked skeptical. "You have experience teaching?" Mrs. Caldwell asked. Sarah nodded, though the truth was more complicated. She had tutored her younger siblings and had helped at the church school back home, but she'd never been a proper teacher. Still, she needed work, and these children clearly needed help. "I attended the Hartford Seminary for Young Ladies," she said, which was true, though she'd left under circumstances she preferred not to think about. "I'm well-versed in reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic sciences." Sheriff Hartwell stepped forward. "Miss Mitchell, are you certain you'd want to take this on? Teaching can be challenging, especially with some of these young ones." As if to prove his point, a paper airplane sailed across the room, followed by the sound of giggling. Sarah walked over to the child who had thrown it, a boy of perhaps 8, with dirt on his face and mischief in his eyes. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Tommy," the boy mumbled, suddenly shy. Sarah picked up the paper airplane and examined it. "This is excellent craftsmanship, Tommy. Did you know that the principles you use to make this fly are the same ones that engineers use to design bridges and buildings?" Tommy's eyes widened with interest, and Sarah felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. This was something she could do. Something that felt right in a way that nothing had for months. "I'll take the position. When can I start?" The relief on his face was unmistakable. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. The town council will need to approve your appointment officially, but I think I can speak for them when I say we're grateful for your offer." As Mrs. Caldwell gathered her things and left, muttering under her breath about city girls who don't know what they're getting into, Sarah found herself alone with the sheriff and a classroom full of curious children. "All right, everyone," she said, clapping her hands together. "Let's start with introductions. I'm Miss Mitchell, and I'm going to be your new teacher." Over the next few hours, Sarah discovered that the children of Redemption Creek were as diverse as the adults who had brought them west. There was Tommy, the paper airplane maker, whose father worked at the lumber mill. Mary, a serious girl of 10, whose mother had died the previous winter, leaving her to care for her younger brother. Jake, a teenager who clearly thought he was too old for school, but attended because his parents insisted. And little Emma, barely 6 years old, who spoke in whispers and flinched whenever anyone raised their voice. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm of teaching. She told stories to illustrate mathematical concepts, had the children write about their families and their dreams, and even incorporated Tommy's paper airplane into a lesson about physics. By the time Sheriff Hartwell returned to check on them, the classroom was filled with the sound of engaged learning rather than chaos. "How did it go?" he asked as the children filed out for the day. Sarah wiped chalk dust from her hands and smiled. "Better than I expected. They're good children. They just needed someone to believe in them." "And what about you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Do you need someone to believe in you?" The question caught Sarah off guard, and for a moment, she felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart begin to crack. There was something in his eyes, a kindness that made her want to tell him everything, about her real name, about why she'd really come west, about the shame and fear that followed her like shadows. Instead, she busied herself with straightening the desks. "I should get back to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson will be serving dinner soon." "Miss Mitchell," he said as she reached the door, "if you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she walked back through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sheriff Cole Hartwell was the kind of man who meant what he said. And that terrified her more than anything else. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into sleep, Sarah allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to tell someone the truth, to share the burden she'd been carrying alone for so long. But then she remembered the look in her father's eyes when he'd discovered her secret, the way her mother had turned away as if Sarah had become invisible, and the cruel laughter of the man who had promised to marry her before abandoning her to face the consequences alone. No, she decided, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, no matter how kind the listener might seem. She would teach the children, earn her keep, and build a new life as Sarah Mitchell. The woman she had been before, Sarah McKenna, with all her mistakes and shame, would remain buried in the past where she belonged. But as sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's dreams were filled with gentle brown eyes and a voice that promised safety in a world that had shown her precious little of it. The weeks that followed established a routine that Sarah found both comforting and terrifying in its normalcy. Each morning, she would wake before dawn, dress carefully in one of her 2 respectable dresses, and make her way to the schoolhouse. The children had taken to her with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. Even Jake, the reluctant teenager, had begun participating in discussions about literature and history. Sheriff Hartwell made a habit of stopping by the school, ostensibly to check on the children's welfare. But Sarah noticed that his visits often coincided with the end of the school day, when she would be alone, tidying up and preparing lessons for the next day. "The town council is very pleased with your work," he said one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe as Sarah erased the day's lessons from the blackboard. "Test scores are up, and, more importantly, the children actually want to come to school." Sarah felt a flush of pride at his words. "They're remarkable children. They just needed someone to see their potential." "Like their teacher," he said quietly. Sarah's hand stilled on the blackboard. "I'm nothing special, Sheriff. Just someone who needed work and found it." "I think you're wrong about that." He stepped into the classroom, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I've been watching you with those children, Miss Mitchell. You have a gift." The way he said her false name made Sarah's stomach clench with guilt. Every day, the lie grew heavier, especially when she saw the genuine respect and growing affection in his eyes. She turned to face him, intending to deflect the conversation as she always did, but found herself caught by the intensity of his gaze. "Sheriff Hartwell." "Cole," he corrected gently. "I think we've known each other long enough for first names, don't you?" "Cole," she said, and his name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I should get back to Mrs. Patterson's. She worries if I'm late for dinner." But instead of stepping aside to let her pass, Cole moved closer. "Sarah," he said, and the way he spoke her name, even the false version of it, made her heart race. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk with me this Sunday after church. There's a place I'd like to show you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should say no, should maintain the careful distance she'd established between herself and everyone in Redemption Creek. But looking into his earnest face, she found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "I'd like that," she whispered. The smile that spread across his features was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Good. I'll call for you after the service." That Sunday, Sarah dressed with more care than she had in months, choosing her better dress and pinning her hair in a style that she hoped looked both respectable and attractive. She sat through Reverend Morrison's sermon about redemption and second chances, acutely aware of Cole's presence in the pew behind her. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright morning sunshine, Cole appeared at her elbow. Ready for that walk? He led her away from the main street, past the last of the houses and out onto a path that wound through the prairie grass. The day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of a creek babbling over stones. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as they walked side by side, careful not to let their hands brush. "You'll see," Cole said with a mysterious smile. "It's not much further." They crested a small hill, and Sarah gasped at the sight that greeted her. Below them lay a hidden valley, green and lush, with a crystal-clear stream running through its center. Wildflowers carpeted the meadow in brilliant splashes of color: purple lupins, yellow sunflowers, and delicate white daisies that danced in the breeze. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, unconsciously moving closer to Cole. "I found this place when I first came to Redemption Creek," he said, his voice soft with memory. "I was running from some things myself back then. This place helped me find peace." Sarah looked at him with new understanding. "What were you running from?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the valley below. "The war," he said finally. "I did things, saw things that I thought I'd never be able to forget. When I came home, I couldn't settle, couldn't find my place in the world I'd left behind. And this place helped?" He nodded. "Something about the beauty of it, the peace. It reminded me that there was still good in the world, still things worth protecting." He turned to look at her, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. "I wanted to share it with you because I think you understand what it's like to carry burdens that feel too heavy to bear alone." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. He was offering her exactly what she'd been longing for: understanding, acceptance, a chance to share the weight of her secrets. But the risk was too great. If he knew the truth about who she really was, about what she'd done— "She should go back," she said suddenly, taking a step away from him. "Mrs. Patterson will be expecting me for Sunday dinner." Confusion flickered across Cole's features, followed by something that looked like hurt. "Of course. I didn't mean to keep you." They walked back to town in uncomfortable silence, and Sarah cursed herself for ruining what had been a perfect moment. But as they reached the boarding house, Cole caught her hand gently. "Sarah," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up at him. "Whatever it is you are running from, whatever brought you to Redemption Creek, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is who you are now, the woman I've come to know. And that woman is someone worth knowing." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, and she pulled her hand free before she could do something foolish like tell him everything. "Good day, Sheriff," she said formally, and fled into the boarding house before he could respond. That night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Cole's words echoing in her mind. He thought he knew her, but he only knew the carefully constructed facade she'd created. If he knew the truth, that she was Sarah McKenna, the disgraced daughter of a prominent Boston family, that she'd been seduced and abandoned by a married man, that she carried the shame of her family's rejection and society's condemnation, would he still think she was worth knowing? The answer, Sarah was certain, was no. And that knowledge broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She organized a harvest festival for the school, complete with spelling bees and recitation contests that drew the entire town. She started a lending library in one corner of the classroom, using books donated by families and a few precious volumes she'd brought with her from Boston. She even convinced the town council to fund basic supplies for science experiments, much to the delight of students like Tommy, who had developed a fascination with how things worked. But despite her professional success, Sarah found it increasingly difficult to maintain her emotional distance from the people of Redemption Creek. Mrs. Patterson had become like a mother to her, offering advice and comfort with the wisdom of someone who had seen much of life. The children had claimed pieces of her heart that she hadn't known she still possessed. And Cole continued to be unfailingly kind and respectful, but Sarah could see the questions in his eyes, the careful way he watched her as if trying to solve a puzzle. He still stopped by the school regularly, but their conversations had become more formal, more guarded. Sarah told herself this was for the best, but the growing distance between them felt like a physical ache. The crisis came on a cold October morning, when Sarah arrived at the school to find little Emma huddled in the corner, her dress torn and her face streaked with tears. The other children clustered around her, their young faces tight with concern and anger. "What happened?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the frightened child. "It was Mr. Garrett," Tommy said, his hands clenched into fists. He was drunk again, and he was yelling at Emma's ma. When Emma tried to help, he pushed her down. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd heard whispers about Emma's stepfather, a man who drank too much and had a reputation for violence. But she'd hoped the rumors were exaggerated. Looking at Emma's frightened face and torn dress, she knew they weren't. "Mary," she said to the oldest girl, "take the children and start them on their reading lesson. I'll be right back." Sarah found Cole at the sheriff's office, reviewing wanted posters that had come in on the morning stage. He looked up as she burst through the door, and his expression immediately shifted to concern. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "It's Emma," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Her stepfather heard her. "The children said he was drunk and violent, and she's terrified. Cole, we have to do something." Cole was already reaching for his hat and gun belt. "Where is she now?" "At the school. I left her with the other children. But Cole, what if he comes looking for her? What if? Hey! Cole's hand settled on her shoulders, steady and warm. Take a breath, we'll handle this. But as they walked quickly toward the school, Sarah's mind was racing with memories she'd tried to bury. She remembered her own terror, her own helplessness in the face of a man's anger and violence. She remembered the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the careful lies told to explain away injuries, the crushing weight of shame and fear. At the school, Cole knelt beside Emma with infinite gentleness, his voice soft as he asked her questions about what had happened. The little girl's answers painted a picture of escalating violence that made Sarah's hands shake with rage and remembered fear. "I'm going to have a talk with Mr. Garrett," Cole said finally, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "Emma, you're gonna stay here with Miss Mitchell until I get back, all right?" But before he could leave, the schoolhouse door slammed open, and a large man with bloodshot eyes and whiskey on his breath stumbled inside. Sarah instinctively moved to shield Emma, her heart hammering with terror. "There you are, you little brat," Garrett slurred, pointing an unsteady finger at Emma. "Causing trouble for me again, are you? Come here." "Mr. Garrett," Cole said, his voice deadly calm as he stepped between the man and the children. "I think you need to leave." "Don't tell me what to do, Sheriff," Garrett snarled. "That's my stepdaughter, and I'll discipline her as I see fit." "Not anymore," Cole said, quietly. "Emma is under the protection of this town now." Garrett's face twisted with rage, and Sarah saw his hand move toward the knife at his belt. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Please," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "She's just a child. Whatever anger you're feeling, whatever pain, taking it out on her won't make it better. I know because I've been where she is. I know what it's like to be afraid, to feel helpless and alone. But hurting her will only create more pain, more fear. Is that really what you want?" Something in her voice, some raw honesty that came from her own buried trauma, seemed to reach through Garrett's drunken rage. His hands stilled, and for a moment, Sarah saw not a monster, but a broken man drowning in his own pain. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I lost everything. My wife, my farm, my boys in the war. Emma's mother was supposed to help me forget, but every time I look at that child, I see what I can't have, what I'll never have again." "I do understand," Sarah said softly. "Loss can make us do terrible things, can make us hurt the people we should protect. But Emma isn't responsible for your pain, just like you weren't responsible for the war or the losses it brought. She's an innocent child who needs love and safety, not more hurt." Garrett stared at her for a long moment, tears mixing with the anger in his eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the fight seemed to go out of him. His shoulders sagged, and he stumbled backward. "I can't. I don't know how to," he mumbled, then turned and fled from the schoolhouse. In the silence that followed, Sarah realized she was shaking. Cole's arms came around her, strong and steady, and she allowed herself to lean into his warmth for just a moment before pulling away. "That was incredibly brave," he said quietly, "and incredibly foolish. He could have hurt you." "He could have hurt Emma," Sarah replied. "I couldn't let that happen." Cole studied her face with those perceptive brown eyes. "You spoke like someone who understood his pain, and hers." Sarah felt the familiar panic rise in her chest. She'd revealed too much, shown too much of herself. "I should check on the children," she said, turning away. But Cole caught her hand. "Sarah, whatever happened to you before you came here, nothing happened," she said quickly. I care about these children, that's all." She could see in his eyes that he didn't believe her, but he let her go. As Sarah gathered the frightened children around her and tried to restore some normalcy to their day, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble. That evening, Cole returned to tell her that he'd found Garrett passed out behind the saloon and had arranged for him to leave town on the morning stage. Emma would stay with a kind family who had offered to take her in. It was the best possible outcome, but Sarah felt no relief. "You saved that little girl today," Cole said, as they stood outside the boarding house in the gathering dusk. "But I can't help feeling that you were saving more than just her." Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting the urge to tell him everything. "Sometimes we see ourselves in others," she said carefully. "Sarah," Cole said, and there was something different in his voice, something that made her look up at him. "I've been thinking about what you said today, about understanding pain and loss. I've been thinking about a lot of things, actually." "Cole, I'm falling in love with you," he said simply, and the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I know you're carrying secrets, and I know you're afraid to trust me with them. But I need you to know that whatever they are, they won't change how I feel about you." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." He stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see the best in everyone around you. I love how you make those children feel like they matter, how you've brought light to this town just by being in it. I love the woman you are, Sarah, not the woman you think you should be." "But I'm not," Sarah began, then stopped. How could she explain that the woman he loved was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide the shameful truth of who she really was? "You're not what?" Cole asked gently. Sarah looked into his honest, loving face and felt her heart break. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered. "Then tell me who you are," he said. "Trust me with the truth." For a moment, Sarah wavered on the edge of confession. The words were right there, desperate to be spoken after months of careful silence. But then she remembered her father's face when he discovered her secret, the way her mother had wept with shame, the cruel laughter of the man who had promised to love her and then abandoned her to face the consequences alone. "I can't," she said, pulling away from his touch. "I'm sorry, Cole, but I can't." The hurt in his eyes was almost unbearable, but Sarah forced herself to turn away and walk into the boarding house. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she could hear him calling her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, because if she did, she would tell him everything, and then she would lose him just as surely as she'd lost everyone else who had ever mattered to her. That night, Sarah sat by her window and wrote a letter she would never send, pouring out all the words she couldn't say aloud. She told him about Sarah McKenna, the naive girl who had believed in love and promises. She told him about the married man who had seduced her with pretty words and false promises, about the scandal that had destroyed her family's reputation, about the baby she had lost and the shame that had driven her west. She wrote until her hand cramped and her tears blurred the ink, and then she burned the letter in the small fireplace, watching her confessions turn to ash. Some truths, she told herself, were too dangerous to share. Some secrets were too heavy for even the strongest shoulders to bear. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Cole's words. "I love the woman you are, not the woman you think you should be." If only he knew how desperately she wanted to believe that could be true. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Redemption Creek in snow and forcing the townspeople to draw closer together for warmth and companionship. Sarah found herself spending more time at the boarding house in the evenings, helping Mrs. Patterson with mending and listening to the older woman's stories of her own journey west. "You know," Mrs. Patterson said one evening as they sat by the fire, "I wasn't always Mrs. Patterson." Sarah looked up from the shirt she was mending. "What do you mean?" "I mean I had a different name once, a different life. I was married to a man back in Missouri who drank too much and had fists that were too quick to fly. One day, I decided I'd had enough, so I took what little money I could scrape together and headed west." Sarah's needle stilled in her hand. "What happened to your husband?" "Far as I know, he's still back in Missouri, probably telling anyone who'll listen that his wife ran off and left him." Patterson's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "Course, that's not the name I use now, and it's not the story I tell folks who ask. Aren't you afraid someone will find out?" Mrs. Patterson set down her own sewing and looked directly at Sarah. "Honey, half the people in this town are running from something. The other half are running to something. Either way, we're all just trying to build new lives from the pieces of our old ones." Sarah felt her cheeks burn under the older woman's knowing gaze. "I don't know what you mean. Don't you?" Mrs. Patterson smiled gently. "Sarah, dear, I've been watching you for months now. You're a good woman with a kind heart, but you're carrying a burden that's eating you alive. And that young sheriff of ours is walking around like a man who's lost his best friend." "Sheriff Hartwell and I we're friends," Sarah said weakly. "Honey, I may be old, but I'm not blind. That man is head over heels in love with you, and unless I'm very much mistaken, you feel the same way about him." Sarah set down her mending and stared into the fire. "It doesn't matter how we feel. Some things are too complicated to fix." "Are they?" Mrs. Hartwell said. Patterson leaned forward in her chair. "Or are we just too scared to try?" Before Sarah could answer, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Mrs. Patterson frowned. It was late for visitors, and the weather was too harsh for casual calls. She opened the door to reveal Cole, his face grim and his coat covered with snow. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I need to speak with Miss Mitchell. It's urgent." Sarah rose from her chair, her heart hammering with sudden fear. "What's wrong?" Cole's eyes found hers across the room. "There's been an accident. The Hendersons' cabin caught fire, and they're asking for you. Little Mary is asking for you specifically." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and followed Cole out into the swirling snow, her mind racing with worry for the serious little girl who had lost her mother and now faced another tragedy. The Henderson cabin was on the outskirts of town, and by the time they arrived, the fire was mostly out, leaving behind a blackened shell and the acrid smell of smoke. Mary Henderson sat on a blanket near the doctor's wagon, her face streaked with soot and tears. When she saw Sarah, she ran into her arms with a sob. "Miss Mitchell, I was so scared. The fire started so fast, and Papa was trying to save our things, and I couldn't find my mother's Bible and—" "Shh," Sarah soothed, holding the girl close. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." "But we lost everything," Mary whispered. "Papa says we'll have to leave town, find somewhere else to start over. But I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave you." Sarah's heart clenched at the despair in the child's voice. She looked around at the gathered townspeople, seeing the same helplessness in their faces that she felt in her own heart. The Hendersons were good people, but they had little money and no family to turn to. Starting over would mean leaving Redemption Creek, probably forever. "We'll figure something out," Sarah said, though she had no idea what. Over the next few days, the town rallied around the Henderson family with the kind of generosity that Sarah had come to expect from the people of Redemption Creek. Clothes were donated, food was provided, and temporary shelter was arranged. But it wasn't enough to replace what they'd lost, and everyone knew that the Hendersons would eventually have to move on. Sarah found herself lying awake at night, thinking about Mary's tear-streaked face and desperate plea not to be separated from the only stability she'd known since her mother's death. An idea began to form in Sarah's mind, dangerous and terrifying, but impossible to ignore. She had money, not much, but enough. Hidden in her carpet bag was a small pouch containing the jewelry her grandmother had left her. Pieces she'd managed to save when she'd fled Boston. They were worth enough to help the Hendersons rebuild. Maybe even enough to buy them a small piece of land where they could start fresh. But using that money would mean revealing more about herself than she'd ever intended. The jewelry was distinctive, expensive, the kind of pieces that belonged to a wealthy Boston family. If anyone recognized them, if anyone started asking questions, Sarah stared at the ceiling of her small room and thought about Mary's frightened face, about little Emma's tears, about all the children who had come to trust her and depend on her. Then she thought about Cole's words. "I love the woman you are, not the woman you think you should be." Maybe it was time to find out if that was really true. The next morning, Sarah walked to the sheriff's office with her grandmother's jewelry wrapped carefully in a silk scarf. Her hands shook as she pushed open the door, but her resolve was firm. Cole looked up from his desk, and Sarah saw the careful politeness that had replaced the warmth in his eyes since their last conversation. "Miss Mitchell, what can I do for you?" "I want to help the Hendersons," Sarah said without preamble. "I have some things that might be valuable enough to give them a fresh start." She unwrapped the jewelry and placed it on his desk. A pearl necklace, diamond earrings, a sapphire brooch that had belonged to her great-grandmother. Cole's eyes widened as he took in the obvious quality and value of the pieces. "Sarah," he said slowly, "these are worth a fortune. Where did you—" He stopped, understanding dawning in his eyes. "These belong to your family." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Your real family," Cole continued. "The one you left behind when you came west." "Yes," Sarah whispered. Cole stood and walked around the desk, stopping just in front of her. "What was your real name?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment of truth she'd been dreading and longing for in equal measure. "Sarah McKenna," she said, her voice barely audible. "McKenna." Cole's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. "I know that name. Boston McKenna? The shipping family?" Sarah closed her eyes, waiting for the recognition to dawn, for the judgment and disgust that would surely follow. The McKenna scandal had been front-page news in Boston. The prominent family's daughter seduced and abandoned. The shame that had rocked high society. The whispers and speculation that had followed her everywhere. "You're Thomas McKenna's daughter," Cole said quietly. "The one who—" "Yes," Sarah said quickly, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I'm the one who brought shame to my family's name. I'm the one who was foolish enough to believe a married man's lies, who was naive enough to think that love could conquer everything. I'm the one who lost everything, my reputation, my family, my—" Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish. Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those perceptive brown eyes. Sarah braced herself for the condemnation, the disgust, the careful distance that would replace whatever feelings he'd had for her. Instead, he reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. "You're the one who was brave enough to start over," he said softly. "You're the one who turned pain into compassion, who used your own suffering to help others. You're the one who saved Emma from a life of fear, who gave Mary hope when she needed it most, who brought light to this town just by being in it." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "But you don't understand. I was ruined, Cole. Completely and utterly ruined. No decent man would ever—" "I don't care," Cole said firmly. "I don't care about your past, about what some narrow-minded people in Boston thought about you. I care about the woman standing in front of me right now, the woman who would give up her most precious possessions to help a family in need." "But I'm not pure," Sarah whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of her shame. "I'm not innocent or untouched or any of the things a man like you deserves." Cole's thumbs brushed away her tears with infinite gentleness. "Sarah, do you think I'm pure? Do you think I'm innocent? I've killed men in war. I've made mistakes that haunt me every night. I've done things I'm not proud of, things that would make you turn away if you knew. That's different." "No, it's not." His voice was firm but kind. "We've both been broken by life, Sarah. We've both made choices we regret, carried burdens that felt too heavy to bear. But that doesn't make us unworthy of love. It makes us human." Sarah stared into his eyes, searching for any sign of judgment or disgust, but found only love and acceptance. "How can you say that? How can you look at me and not see? I see a woman who has survived more than most people could endure." Cole interrupted. "I see someone who turned her pain into purpose, who chose to help others instead of becoming bitter. I see the woman I love, Sarah. Not Sarah McKenna or Sarah Mitchell, but you, exactly as you are." The words broke something open inside Sarah's chest. Some tight knot of shame and fear that she'd carried for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. She collapsed against Cole's chest, sobbing with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I don't deserve you," she cried, the words muffled against his shirt. Cole's arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips press against the top of her head. "Then let me be the one who says you do," he whispered. They stood there in the quiet sheriff's office, holding each other as the morning sun streamed through the windows. And for the first time since she'd fled Boston, Sarah felt like she might actually be home. "What happens now?" she asked, when her tears finally subsided. Cole pulled back to look at her, his hands still gentle on her face. "Now we sell these beautiful pieces and help the Hendersons rebuild their lives. And then, if you'll have me, we start building a life of our own." "Are you asking me to marry you, Sheriff Hartwell?" Sarah asked, a tremulous smile breaking through her tears. "I'm asking you to trust me with your heart," Cole said. "I'm asking you to believe that love can be stronger than shame, that the future can be brighter than the past. I'm asking you to stay in Redemption Creek and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you deserve every happiness this world has to offer." Sarah looked into his honest, loving face and felt the last of her walls crumble. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." When Cole kissed her, gentle and sure and full of promise, Sarah finally understood what Mrs. Patterson had meant about second chances. Sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the ashes of what came before. Sometimes love really could conquer everything, not by erasing the past, but by transforming it into something new and precious and worth fighting for. As spring returned to Redemption Creek, bringing with it new life and fresh beginnings, Sarah McKenna, now Sarah Hartwell, stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched her students play in the warm sunshine. The Henderson family had rebuilt their home with the money from her grandmother's jewelry, and Mary's laughter rang out across the schoolyard like music. Cole appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist in the easy, comfortable way of newlyweds. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Hartwell." Sarah leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural it felt to be held, to be loved, to be accepted completely for who she was. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. A year ago, I thought my story was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. And now?" Sarah smiled, watching little Emma chase Tommy around the schoolyard, while Mary helped the younger children with their letters. "Now I think maybe it was just the beginning." Cole pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Sarah Hartwell." "I love you too," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As the afternoon sun painted the prairie in shades of gold, and the children's laughter filled the air, Sarah felt a peace she'd never thought possible settle into her bones. She had found her place in the world at last, not as the woman she'd been expected to be, but as the woman she'd chosen to become. And in Cole's arms, surrounded by the community that had embraced her, she finally understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about writing a new future. One choice, one day, one act of love at a time. The woman who had once been Sarah McKenna, broken and ashamed, had become Sarah Hartwell, beloved and whole. And in the small frontier town of Redemption Creek, where second chances bloomed like wildflowers in the spring, she had found not just love, but the courage to love herself.